It's August 24th, 2001. Picture this. You're on an overnight flight from Toronto to Portugal, Air Transat Flight 236. You're over the vast, black emptiness of the Atlantic Ocean. Most of the 306 people on board are asleep or just relaxing. Everything seems totally normal. But up in the cockpit, a crisis is quietly brewing. One that's about to turn this routine trip into one of the most unbelievable survival stories in the history of flight. So let's just let that sink in for a second. Imagine a 200-ton passenger jet flying miles above the Earth, and suddenly, silence. The constant, reassuring hum of the engines just stops. The lights go out. And just like that, this massive piece of machinery becomes nothing more than a giant glider, hundreds of kilometers from the closest runway, with nothing but the cold, dark Atlantic below. And that's the big question, right? How on earth does this even happen? This wasn't some crazy storm, it wasn't a hijacking. So how does a modern, state-of-the-art airliner just run out of fuel in the middle of the ocean? Well, the answer is this shocking chain reaction of failures that actually started long before the plane even took off. To really understand what went wrong up in the air, we have to rewind. We're going back 9 days before the flight, to a maintenance hangar. You see, this whole thing didn't start with a big explosion. It started with a tiny, seemingly harmless mistake on the ground. It all kicked off during a routine inspection. Mechanics found these tiny little metal chips in the right engine's oil system. Now, in aviation, that is a huge red flag. It means something inside that engine is grinding itself to pieces. Air Transat didn't have a spare, so they borrowed one from Rolls-Royce. And right there, that's when the ticking time bomb was unknowingly set. And here's where one small problem just snowballs. See, the loaner engine was a slightly older model, so the fittings for the hydraulic and fuel lines were just different. The head technician tried to do the right thing. He went to look up the procedure in the online manual, but the network was down. Now, the manual was actually on CDs, right there in the same building, but he didn't know that. Feeling the pressure to get this multi-million-dollar plane back in the air, he took a shortcut. He basically forced parts from the new and old designs to fit together. And that decision created a fatal flaw. You know, think of it like trying to jam an old USB-A plug into a new USB-C port. It might kind of look like it fits if you force it, but the connections are all wrong and you're going to break something. That is exactly what happened here. These two mismatched tubes, one for fuel, one for hydraulics, were jammed right up against each other. So with every single flight, the engine's vibrations caused those tubes to rub and grind together, slowly wearing away at the fuel line. A crack wasn't just possible. At that point, it was inevitable. Okay, so let's jump back to the night of the flight. As Flight 236 is cruising over the Atlantic, that ticking time bomb from the maintenance hangar is finally about to hit zero. But a bad repair job was only the first step. A series of mistakes made in the cockpit would turn this dangerous situation into a full-blown catastrophe. So the first domino falls just before 5 in the morning. The fuel line finally gives way and cracks open. But here's the unbelievable part. This model of Airbus didn't have an automatic fuel leak detector. So for almost an hour, jet fuel is just gushing out of the engine into the night sky, and nobody has a clue. When a fuel imbalance warning finally flashes, the crew makes a critical error. They assume it's just a sensor glitch, and instead of pulling out the emergency checklist, they decide to follow the procedure from memory. And this decision is what turned a manageable emergency into a nightmare. Thinking they were just balancing the fuel between the wings, the pilots opened a thing called the crossfeed valve. But what that actually did was connect the full fuel tank in the good wing directly to the engine with the massive leak. Instead of stopping the problem, they started feeding all of their remaining fuel straight to the source of the leak, basically draining the entire plane of fuel at twice the speed. Then, at 6:26 in the morning, the inevitable happens. The second engine sputters and dies. Suddenly, all the cockpit screens go black. The cabin is plunged into an eerie, terrifying silence. And this is the start of the longest 19 minutes of everyone's lives. A powerless, unprecedented glide towards a tiny speck of land in the middle of the ocean. At the end of the day, this is the only number that really matters. 306 souls on board. That's 293 passengers and 13 crew members, and every single one of them was now completely dependent on the skill of the pilots and the simple laws of physics. And this was the insane challenge they faced. 144 kilometers. That's how far they had to fly as a glider to reach the nearest runway, Lajes Air Base in the Azores, a distance that no commercial jetliner had ever even attempted to glide before. And this number? Well, this one says it all. 0. 0 working engines to get them there. They had one shot. That's it. There were no do-overs, no go-arounds. If they came up short, the only thing waiting for them was the freezing cold Atlantic Ocean. Back in the cabin, the silence was deafening. You could actually hear your own heart pounding. Then, chaos. The crew, terrified themselves, started shouting instructions. One flight attendant was so overwhelmed, she turned to a passenger and just pleaded, "Please help me." All around the plane, people started praying, strangers were holding hands, as the brutal reality of their situation started to sink in. Then the crew began preparing everyone for the worst possible outcome, ditching in the ocean. Now, people have survived water landings, but trying to do it at night with no power to judge your height above the rolling waves, it's considered almost impossible. Passengers remembered seeing documentaries about plane crashes, and they knew their chances of surviving the impact, let alone the hypothermic water, were practically 0. But this is where sheer skill and maybe a little bit of luck turned a certain disaster into one of aviation's greatest stories. The captain, Robert Pichet, just so happened to be an expert glider pilot. He used that unique skill to perfectly manage the plane's descent. Flying on just a trickle of emergency power from a tiny propeller called the ram air turbine, they finally saw them, the runway lights of Lajes. They had one chance to land this 200-ton glider. The landing was anything but gentle. It was violent. Without engine power for reverse thrust, they came in way too fast and had to slam on the emergency brakes. 8 of the 10 main tires instantly blew out. The gear was sparking. It even caught fire. But they were on solid ground. In the cabin, there was this moment of stunned silence and then an eruption of applause and tears. In under 2 minutes, all 306 people were off the plane. It was an absolute miracle. Everyone had survived. So the big question is, why did this happen? Well, this is a perfect textbook example of what safety experts call the Swiss cheese model. The idea is that disasters almost never happen because of one single big failure. They happen when all the holes in multiple layers of defense, the design of the plane, the maintenance, the procedures, the human actions, when all those holes just happen to line up perfectly. A similar fuel leak had happened 4 years earlier, and the report recommended an automated warning system, but it was never made mandatory. Any one of these failures on its own wouldn't have been a catastrophe. But on that specific day, they all lined up and Flight 236 flew right through the holes. In the aftermath, Captain Pichet was treated like a global hero. But then, just days later, the story took a shocking twist. The media revealed that he'd actually served jail time in the US for drug smuggling 20 years earlier. It was a bizarre revelation, but it didn't change the fact that his skills saved 306 lives. Air Transat, on the other hand, got hit with the largest fine in Canadian aviation history for their shoddy maintenance practices. And really, that's the big takeaway here. The story of Flight 236 is an incredible tale of skill and survival for sure, but it's also a powerful, powerful warning. It shows us how a few small, seemingly minor shortcuts, a couple of ignored warnings, and a little pressure can all line up to create an absolute disaster. And it kind of forces you to ask, right? What are the small warnings, the little shortcuts that we all ignore every day in the complex systems of our own lives?